All right, everybody, welcome back to Virginia and U.S. history. Today, we're going to be getting into the causes of the American Civil War and the main events of the American Civil War. All right, so part one of this video, let's get into things that were the causes. Some of this is going to look familiar from some of our last lessons, but it's a quick little reminder. All right, so to get into it, uh, this is most recent that I could find, but we've had roughly 1.264 thousand American soldiers have died in America's wars, all of them. Though the Civil War accounts for half of the military deaths of the United States. Now, just so you know, this number is not just Northern troops. It is combined Northern and Southern troops, the Union and the Confederates, because after the Civil War ended, it was declared that all Confederate soldiers are American veterans. So, because we became one again, we were brothers again. So that's why it's all counted together and why it is the single most costly war, because it was Americans killing Americans. All right, but now let's get into the actual causes of the Civil War. There are five main ones, and we're going to take a look at like the basis of these five things. So, economic and social differences between the North and the South, states versus federal rights under the Constitution, a fight between slave and non-slave state proponents, growth of the abolition movement, and the election of Abraham Lincoln. All right, so let's go ahead and get into this a little bit now. So economics. So the South, after the cotton gin is invented, we become basically a one-crop economy, which is cotton, and heavily dependent on slave labor. The North, we're focused basically on industry, so manufacturing of goods using a lot of immigrant labor, which is cheap to pay. Uh, so the people of these different cultures and classes having to work together in the North is very different from the very stagnant social order, very old way of doing things. Basically, like an aristocracy, you have the rich plantation owners, which are like the nobility. Then you have the regular like shop owners and middle class people. You have the poor white farmers, and then you have the slaves. Very much that social hierarchy. We're going to see something that's going to challenge this. We're going to see a tax on imports, the moral tariff. And that's basically going to tax imported goods from overseas and protect northern manufacturing goods uh, because they want people to buy American made items. But the South, one of the things they do is they do a lot of trade with other places. Like England is a prime example, a big trade partner for the American South during this time. England is buying up a lot of Southern cotton because they have a booming textile industry. They're making a lot of cloth, a lot of clothing. And in exchange, not only is the South taking money payments, but they're also doing trade goods exchange as well. So they're not particularly liking the fact that the goods that they are used to buying from overseas are now costing more money because of this tariff, this tax. All right, state versus federal. So some people, when the Constitution replaced the Articles of Confederation, they believed that it ignored the rights of the states and continued to try and act independent of the federal government. So we're going to see a lot of back and forth, trying to see who's going to win out and hold the power. This idea is going where some states can basically do whatever they want, is going to give this idea of nullification, where the states have the right to basically ignore laws from the federal government they don't agree with. That is not how it works. under the Constitution, which, they all fall under the jurisdiction of, but some states would not particularly care to follow that. So the federal government is going to deny some rights that the states feel that they deserve, and states, they are going to feel very disrespected because of this, and that's going to move towards secession or separation. All right. Expansion of slavery. This is one of the biggest issues. So 1820, the Missouri Compromise, we've talked about already, but the basics of it again, we're going to go over those compromises, all three of them again. So Missouri Compromise, Maine comes in as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, and territories north of Missouri would be free, south of Missouri would be slave. Temporarily, this will settle the dispute over going westward with the expansion of slavery and maintaining the balance between free and slave states when it comes to like Congress with representatives. So temporary fix. Then we're going to have this idea where people are going to start taking sides between two different ways of thinking. So we're going to have popular sovereignty, where each territory, this is a movement for wanting these things, popular sovereignty, where each territory is going to vote whether they want to allow slavery. And this is, how we're going to get into Compromise 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's all going to deal with popular sovereignty because they don't want to deal with that border that the Missouri Compromise put in place, because land size wise, there's a lot more land that's eligible to become free rather than slave. All right, Free Soil Party. This was a political party that believed the spread of slavery would not be allowed on the free soil of the Western territories. So basically, stop the spread of slavery just in general. They wanted all the land that was not already declared for slavery to stay as free territories and free states when they eventually become states, and just limit slavery to where it already existed. All right, Compromise of 1850, California comes in as a free state, but there would be no restrictions on slavery in territory taken from Mexico because of like the Mexican-American War. And slave trade in Washington, D.C. would be outlawed. You could no longer buy or sell slaves in D.C., but you could still have them if you owned them already. Southerners, they were also allowed to greater power in being able to recover slaves who ran away up north to try and escape slavery. They had more power to reclaim their quote unquote lost property. All right, which is the Fugitive Slave Act, where they could basically point out like, hey, that is an escaped slave of mine, and I want them back. The messed up part was you didn't need proof. So you could basically just go up to Chicago, for example, look at a random African American person and be like, that person is actually a slave that ran away from me. And you basically could theoretically get a slave for free in that way. Now, with runaway slaves, federal marshals, federal police, essentially, they were required to help catch the slaves, and they could basically force anyone to help them. So yeah, that's something that gets put in place. Now, getting into some of the abolitionist stuff. Here's one example. I talked about it last time a little bit. The author Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. She wrote it depicting the cruel nature of slavery. And it's going to really set a fire in the anti-slavery movement and really get them pumped up and moving. The only downside is that she had never actually been to a Southern plantation, so she just wrote on the hearsay that people had basically been talking about and spreading rumors about for the treatment of slaves in the South. Granted, a lot of things would be true, But some things, not a lot, but some things would be blown out of proportion. Like she, if I remember correctly, left out the fact that a lot of slave owners in the South were not these big plantation owners. Yes, there were the big plantations where there would be, hundreds of slaves. But she left out the other aspects where there might just be a poor farmer who has like one or two slaves tops, and they work out in the fields with them almost like they are just co-workers. All right. There would also be, of course, the Liberator, that newspaper, magazine, publication. There would also be people like Frederick Douglass, who was a runaway slave who escaped up north and became a key figure in the abolitionist movement and promoting the enlistment of African Americans into the Union Army during the war. He's one of the most famous abolitionists, like out of anybody in American history. All right, Kansas Nebraska Act. We have the debate whether to have northern or southern starting point for the Transcontinental Railroad. That is the railroad that basically goes from the Mississippi River to the West Coast. Uh, and because they don't know whether to start it in the North or in the South, it basically becomes an argument over slavery in the new territories somehow. So we are going to have the territory of Nebraska, which is both Kansas and Nebraska combined at that time. It was just the Nebraska territory, even though it's the modern day states of Kansas and Nebraska combined. Now, it's being organized into a territory, and to win Southern support, they proposed another state to support slavery, Kansas. So basically, they want to split it, and they each are going to be allowed to decide whether they want slavery or not because of popular sovereignty. So the Missouri Compromise is now undone because of this, because both these territories, which are north of that line, get to vote on it. So that is how we get Bleeding Kansas. So here's a little more detail on that. Northerners rush to Kansas because they want to create an anti-slavery majority there, and a lot of people living in Missouri who were that's a slave majority there. That's a slave state. They're going to illegally cross the border and vote for pro-slavery legislature and want to intimidate the anti-slavery people. So we're going to get two governments, basically, one anti and one pro-slavery. We're going to have basically border wars, like a giant gang battle between the two sides, and it's going to last for months, and it's going to lead to the deaths of quite a few people. And the final thing really to talk about is the election of President Abraham Lincoln in 1860. He ran on the pro-abolitionist movement platform. He wanted to basically limit slavery to where it already existed and eventually have it die out of natural causes. Not end it, but just let it die out naturally. And so South Carolina and the rest of the Deep South are going to secede, separate from the country, and form the Confederate States of America. In response to this, Lincoln is going to call up a volunteer army of 75,000 volunteers to serve for about 3 months to march into the South and to get these southern states back in line and stop the rebellion before it gets started. That's really what gets things involved. Like Virginia, the state of Virginia does not join the Confederacy until the decision to raise an army of 75,000 volunteers is given by Lincoln. Because, like, oh, you're going to invade the South? This battle is going to take place in our backyard because we're the border between the North and the South. I guess we got to get involved. All right. And one key little fact to know with these 75,000 troops, Robert E. Lee, the guy who would become the general of the Confederate Army, he was first approached by the U.S. government to be the man in charge of this 75,000 man army, but he refused because he would not fight against his home state of Virginia. He loved the United States. He loved serving in the American military. He loved, you know, just being an American. He was against slavery, but he would not fight against his home and against his family. So that is why he turned down the appointment to command that army and would join the Confederacy. He would do what his state wished of him to do. All right, so that is part one of today's video with the causes of the Civil War. Now, let's go ahead and get into part two, the actual events of the Civil War, the key ones that we need to get into, as well as just a couple things here and there that I just added in because they were interesting. All right, so this is going to be a long and costly war. It's going to end with the North winning and restoring the Union back to one whole piece and the emancipation or freedom of the slaves. That's the wrap up. But how did we get there? All right. So the war, once it gets started, is going to be the most important and biggest test that our constitutional government will ever go through. Survival of the U.S. as one nation is at risk, and everything is going to depend. The survival of the country, the survival of our ideals are going to depend on the outcome of the war. So a lot is riding on this. Now, the major events. So, yep, the election of Lincoln sparks the secession of the southern states, beginning with South Carolina, because they feared that this administration under Lincoln would abolish slavery, ending their economic way of life. So, South Carolina is going to, their militia there essentially, is going to attack the Union base or fort, Fort Sumter, just off the coast. And this is the opening shots of the Civil War, April 12th, 1861. Now, they're going to attempt to take the fort. Kind of goes on for a little while where they're bombarding it. The very first cannon shot was actually fired by a South Carolinian who was a veteran of the War of 1812. They just, as an honor thing, he was a pretty famous guy, pretty well-liked guy in that area, and they allowed him to fire the first shot. The troops who were trapped in the fort, they are actually, one of the stories I heard about them, they are just a fun story now, were responsible for like our modern version of baseball. Like between attacks when they had nothing to do, and while they were waiting to be rescued by some northern ships, they basically played stickball, which was the original version of baseball. And that's how we get a lot of our modern rules that we have for baseball. All right. So Fort Sumter is attacked. The first shots have fired. The battles are on. And this is going to be what gets Virginia and the upper South, like North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, places like that, all involved. All right. Now, this list right here, Civil War battles. Something that you need to know when talking about the Civil War is there are two names for every single battle. We typically know the names of battles by who won the battle. And if a battle is named after a landmark, like Sharpsburg, for example, Sharpsburg is the name of a town. It's usually a physical feature like that, like a town or in particular, mountain. Typically, it's named after whatever town is right there. Is a southern name, like they're called the Army of Northern Virginia. It's a physical landmark. Then if it is a northern name, it's named after a body of water. So, for example, Sharpsburg, Antietam. We know it as Antietam because it was a northern victory, and the battle was fought alongside Antietam Creek. And like the Northern Army was called the Army of the Potomac, like the Potomac River. So if it's named after water, it's the North. If it's named after a landmark, it's the South. All right. Speaking of Antietam, this is like this one. Single bloodiest day of battle in American history. More Americans were killed in this single day than any other time in our history in one day. All right. So, as you can see here, the Confederates were vastly outnumbered. They were spread out into different areas. So, and the Union Army, the North, was in one chunk. So they basically engaged in the biggest chunk of the Confederate Army and beat them back pretty badly. When even if you look at the casualties, um, percentage wise, the Confederates lost a much higher percentage, even though the Union troops lost a lot more men. Statistically, it was a smaller number, like percentage wise. All right. And this is going to prompt President Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which is going to shift the focus of the war, not only to just rebuild the country together into one, but also to shift the purpose of fighting the war, not just to rebuild the country and bring it back together, but to free the slaves. Now, that is important for one reason. And that reason is the South was in negotiations with France and the British to basically get an alliance with them against the North. Okay. Now, with France and Britain's aid, they could have won the rebellion and we would have two different countries. But now that we have shifted the reason for fighting the war to getting rid of slavery, that means that the British and French are not going to want to get involved. They have already outlawed slavery in their empires at this time. They don't support it anymore. So if they don't support it, how can they give aid to a country that does? So they're out of the picture, and the Confederacy is on their own. All right. Gettysburg, the turning point of the Civil War. After this battle, the Confederacy is on the defense for the rest of the time. So this battle in 1863, the summer of 1863, this is the second attempt at the Confederacy invading the North. The first one was Antietam in Maryland, and the second one is Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. So this fighting is going to take course over about 3 days. The first 2 days are intense fighting. The last day is basically just a standoff between the armies, and then the fourth day, they're gone. They march off. Now, Lee is going to make a number of big mistakes here. The battle lines, like the way the troops are positioned, the Northern Army is in the center, and the Confederacy is surrounding them. Not exactly great for the Confederacy. As you can see, they're outnumbered by almost 30,000 troops. So they have fewer men stretched over a larger area than the Union. So it takes longer for them to do anything. And yeah, so that doesn't exactly work out. The battle is the biggest and bloodiest battle of American history. Antietam's the bloodiest single day, but Gettysburg, because it took course over 2-3 days, is the bloodiest battle. As you can tell here by the casualties and losses, uh, a good 23,000 or so casualties, meaning killed, wounded, captured, or missing for both sides. That is insane amount of casualties. Lots and lots of deaths. Lots and lots of wounded people. Very, very bad situation. All right. Another major event is General William Tecumseh Sherman of the Northern Army. His march to the sea is a huge hit for the Confederacy. It begins when his army is leaving Atlanta and they are marching and destroying everything in their path to Savannah. This is a scorched earth policy. They are destroying military targets, industry, they're destroying bridges, railroads, they're destroying farmland, they're destroying everything. It cripples the Confederacy and helps lead to the surrender because you know travel is crippled, food supplies have been crippled. You know, it's a big hit. And this gets all the way to Appomattox, just down the highway, basically. This is where General Lee is going to surrender to General Grant, April 9th, 1865. Formally, it's going to end the war. Very generous terms are given by Lincoln and Grant to Lee. This quote here, with malice towards none, basically meaning we are not enemies anymore. We are brothers. We must embrace each other as brothers and rebuild our country. Very, very few people faced any jail time at all. Basically, the Confederacy's leadership, like the president, Jefferson Davis, that's basically like the only one of the very few people who even got any jail time. All right. So, an honorable mention for battles is the Battle of the Crater, which is part of the Siege of Petersburg, Virginia. The hole is still in the ground when I talk about the crater. So, the Northern Army is laying siege to Petersburg. And what they're trying to do is they want to get into the fort, they want to beat the Confederacy, they want to take control of Petersburg. So what they do is they dig a tunnel underneath the defensive wall of the Confederate troops. They fill it full of barrels of gunpowder and explosives. They blow up this hole in the line and they send in a bunch of troops, but they didn't account for how deep the hole was going to be. So it was basically just this big hole in the ground. You got hundreds of Union troops packed in there, and it's like shooting fish in a barrel for the Confederates. They're just opening fire down into this hole, hitting guys left and right. They charge down into the hole, and there's a lot of hand-to-hand combat, and it is just chaos between these two relatively small forces, but it is insane the amount of deaths that happened. As you can see, almost half of the Union troops were casualties of this event, and about a quarter of the Confederate troops were casualties. Most of their wounded, of course, being probably from the explosion. All right. Another honorable mention here is this guy. I do a lot of family research. I've built a family tree. This guy is someone who is in my family tree. So I wanted to use this as an example of like, hey, you never know who's in your own family's history. You might find something interesting. This was something interesting I came across. So this is through my father's mother's family. So families from up north originally. Now, this guy, when he was 17 in 1862, he volunteered for the New Jersey Volunteer Regiments, and he would take part in a lot of major battles. One of the key ones being he was in Gettysburg. He was in the area of the battlefield called the Peach Orchard, where General Dan Sickles led his troops basically into an area where there was no cover, and they got tore up. This is however many greats ago grandfather, his unit got tore up. The men that he fought alongside got messed up here pretty bad. Um, he would take part in Battle of Petersburg, sort of. Yeah, he would do at least some stuff there. He actually got captured at Petersburg during that battle, like the end of that battle. Um, and he would be held in a tobacco warehouse for 2 weeks before being taken to Belle Island, which is an infamous Confederate military prison. He was imprisoned there for about 7 months before he was let go. He made his way from Belle Island to Richmond, rejoined with his unit, and was back in action and was a part of the chase after Robert E. Lee to Appomattox. He was at the surrender as well. He went through the entire war practically uninjured except for just a minor shoulder injury to his left shoulder. That's the only thing that happened to him, other than probably some malnourishment and getting sick for a little bit at Belle Island. And honorably discharged June 6, 1865. So, yeah, you never know who you're going to find in your family tree. Like, I got this guy. All right. So, last thing that we're talking about today is some of the key leaders and what they did for the Civil War. So, of course, got to talk about Abraham Lincoln. He's the U.S. president during the Civil War. He insisted that the country be held together by force if necessary. He issues the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, making the cause for fighting the war to free the slaves. And he is where we get the idea that the U.S. is not a collection of independent states, but we are one indivisible, undividable nation. Jefferson Davis, former U.S. Senator who became the Confederacy's president in 1860 when they initially formed. All right, Ulysses S. Grant. He was the Union commander at the end of the war. He won a lot of victories, cost a lot of lives as well. He didn't care how many men he lost as long as he got the results he wanted in winning battles. While that is a barbaric way of looking at it, it's what President Lincoln needed because they needed to win battles to win the war. And Grant was the man to get it done. And at one point, like during the Mexican-American War, like a good, 15, 20 years earlier, Grant actually served with Robert E. Lee, and he brought it up to him at the surrender. And apparently, the rumor goes that Robert E. Lee basically said, "I don't remember you." So throwing that one little jab in there. Now, Robert E. Lee, Confederate General of the Army of Northern Virginia, he opposed separating as well as using force to keep the Union together. I told you earlier he was offered command of the Union Army, but he turned it down because he would not fight against his home state of Virginia. And that is why he sided with the South after Fort Sumter was attacked. But once the war was over, he was one of the biggest supporters of reunification and, fixing the nation and promoting education, because that is how you rebuild. Right. Last person to talk about, Frederick Douglass, a former slave who became a prominent abolitionist. He is the guy who gets Lincoln to want to push for the recruiting of former slaves to fight in the Union Army, which is going to bolster, enlistment numbers by hundreds of thousands of men. And we'll talk about more with that at a later time. All right, that is where we're going to end today. And all right, we'll see you next time.